Nintendo's been beating Sony for 20 years, but it honestly makes sense. Halo is coming to PS5 this year, and Sony has a good surprise for us leading into 2025. How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. I hope you had a great weekend playing a ton of video games. I was stuck inside because of the snowstorm that hit Michigan, where I live, so I played a ton of GTA 5, and I get it. I get the online now. It's awesome. I started a new character. I did the premium edition that they released on PS5. So I got to start with a gun running silo. I got a bunch of cars. It's awesome. I've been having a ton of fun, and I can already tell I'm going to sink a ton of hours into it while I wait for GTA 6. Let me know what you've been playing down in the comments below. But the first news story we got to talk about today is that there's new data out that suggests, well, it doesn't suggest, it just is like hard data, that Sony has been beaten by Nintendo for 20 years running in Japan. Yeah, so Famitsu, they released the sales charts for Japan every month. They released their final sales charts for 2024, and it just solidified that for the 20th year in a row, Nintendo completely dominated the top 10 list of the charts, with the only PlayStation 5 game that actually made it on the charts being Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. At first, you get pissed because it's a grabby headline. It makes people upset to hear that Sony's losing, because we all love PlayStation here on PSReady. The channel's all about PlayStation, so seeing Nintendo, the baby machine, beat out the greatest hardware in the console world, it's just like a bummer. But if you look a little deeper, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, this goes way back to the PS3 generation, and the timing honestly lines up pretty well, where around that generation, things started to shift at Sony, right? Like during the PS1 and 2 generation, you had a lot of Western style games that were absolutely dominating, like GTA 3, GTA Vice City, GTA San Andreas, The Getaway, Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper. All those games are very Western, as in American, or I guess UK oriented, but you also had a lot of Japanese made games coming out that would do well over there. I mean, stuff like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, Kingdom Hearts, the list goes on and on of Japanese style games that would do well over there. And then as you get closer and closer to the release of the Nintendo Switch, there's a split, right? Like Sony moved their entire operation basically to the United States. That was a huge move that happened right around the beginning of the PS4 generation, and they started making games for different tastes. Like, yeah, Sony is a Japan-based company, but PlayStation itself may as well be an American company with how it's run. I mean, we had Jim Ryan, we had Sean Layden, we've had Americans running it for a long time, and then when they leave, you get a replacement running the game side of things that's not American, but he's a European guy, so obviously he has Western sensibilities in his taste of games with Herman Hulst, and then you got a guy in Japan, Hideaki Nishino, running all the hardware, which I honestly think is a cool thing because it's splitting what they each do best. During this massive shift where everything moved over to the United States, Nintendo didn't do that. They're still firmly run by their Japanese Nintendo arm. Like, Nintendo of Japan is the top of the food chain, and then everything else lives under it and just basically does marketing and administrative stuff. And like, yeah, they've got a few satellite studios in Western countries, but when you look at the games they put out, they're mostly Japan-oriented games. Like, the biggest games on Switch are JRPGs and Nintendo first parties. I mean, there's a few outliers that do great in America, like Mario games, Mario Party, Mario Kart, Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. Stuff like that does well everywhere. But they don't have a lot of stuff coming out all the time, like Metroid Prime 4, for example, which we've been waiting for a very long time. So when you look at the games that these two different companies are making, it makes sense why Nintendo dominates in Japan and PlayStation does a really good job over here in the West, because that's the goals that both of those companies have. I mean, Japan's a big country, not geographically, but in terms of people, but it's nowhere near the amount of people who play video games as there are in the United States. So clearly Sony was going for a bigger market than Nintendo, whereas Nintendo, they're making their games with Japan in mind first and hoping that they catch on throughout the rest of the world. Because of stuff like Animal Crossing, everyone and your mom has a Switch now, and it did catch on. So everyone's doing fine is basically the point of this news story. It's not necessarily a war between Sony and Nintendo right now, but I'd imagine that with Xbox kind of falling out and becoming a third-party publisher, that gets rid of a lot of competition for Sony, right? Because if Xbox is a third-party publisher, it doesn't matter if Call of Duty does amazing. It doesn't matter if something like, I don't know, Doom the Dark Ages does amazing, because Sony's going to take a 30% cut of all of those games that are sold on PlayStation by Xbox. So they're just a big third-party publisher at that point. Their only real hardware competition is Nintendo. I love Steam Deck. It's probably my favorite handheld ever made. It's not really competing with Sony. It's Steam as a whole that competes with Sony, and Sony has the benefit of only only having one storefront on their console where people have bought games for 2 generations now. So I don't think they really have anything to worry about there. The true competition for Sony is, of course, Nintendo going forward. So I'm curious if we'll see things kind of shifting in the direction of making more Japanese oriented games so that they can get more spots on the top 10 list when Famitsu does their monthly rankings. But yeah, speaking of falling out and Xbox becoming a third-party publisher, that brings me to the second news story here, which is kind of crazy but not really surprising. You know, they've been putting all these games out on PlayStation. We started with Sea of Thieves and Pentiment and, you know, a few others, and they all did well enough. So now Xbox is looking into the far future and saying, well, any game we make will eventually come to PlayStation. I mean, that's obvious if you look at stuff like Indiana Jones. That cleaned up with awards, it cleaned up with scores. People really wanted to play it on PC. I don't know so much on Xbox, like it did okay on the Game Pass charts, but it also came out that it cannibalized 80% of premium sales with that game having it on Game Pass. So they clearly want to get it out on PlayStation where people are going to pony up money for it, hopefully, if everything goes according to their plan. But Nate the Hate, who's verifiable in his leaks, he leaks a ton of stuff related to Xbox, came out and said that they are not just doing Indiana Jones, they're porting over everything. So stuff like Hellblade 2, which I don't really know why. I don't think that's going to recoup its development cost to port that over to PlayStation, but hey, you do you. They're going to do the Master Chief collection this year. Apparently there's a Gears of War 1 and 2 collection coming out. I don't know why they're leaving out 3 because that's my favorite of the 3. They're getting PlayStation gamers oriented with the beginnings of these franchises so that when there's a new Halo, when there's a new Gears of War like E-Day, when it releases on the console, the PS5, people are going to buy those games because they'll be able to catch up with the entire story. I think there's way less of a risk with that with Halo, obviously, because everyone's played Halo. I mean, for the first part of the 360 generation, the 360 was dominating the PlayStation 3. It only caught up towards the back half. So if you got a 360, it was basically guaranteed that you had Halo 3, and it was like a pretty surefire bet that you would buy ODST for the multiplayer disc or that you'd buy Halo Reach just to see what happened at the beginning of the Halo universe. Like, I think most gamers are familiar with Halo. Gears of War, on the other hand, I mean, the first game is not available on Steam, so PC players can't really play it unless they want to interact with Xbox's garbage app, and the way you run PC games through that app is annoying. It doesn't work very well, the like Windows universal apps. Gears of War 2, not available on PC. Gears of War 3, not available on PC. Gears 4, only locked down to the Xbox app, and then Gears 5 is the only one that's really available on Steam other than Gears Tactics, and Gears 5 is just a miss, in my opinion. Like, it has really cool level design, it has some cool open world elements. The story just misses the point on what people want from Gears of War, trying to bring in a totally new audience in the 5th game. I don't really understand the philosophy there, but it looks like they're recalibrating with Gears E-Day, and that one is smart because you're gonna not miss out on the people who have FOMO because it's the very beginning. It's like the prequel, it's the Halo Reach of the Gears universe. But even for that small group of people who are like, oh, is this Gears 6? I don't want to jump in on the 6th game. They're gonna have at least the first 2 games available on PlayStation before E-Day even comes out to get people familiar with that franchise. So it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, like I always talk about, when Microsoft makes these big moves, I think Sony kind of rushes to follow the leader because at first, a lot of these big moves like Game Pass, they seem like genuinely industry-changing moves that are going to change the way games are played. A bunch of people were subscribing to Game Pass to get the day one exclusives, and then when the exclusives didn't really come or they came out and were broken and busted and buggy, people didn't really stay with Game Pass. They weren't pulling in a lot of new people. Like, it was a very sharp rise and then a very sharp plateau when it comes to Game Pass subscribers. But in that time period, Sony was like, crap, we need to have a subscription service. So they reformulated PlayStation Plus to have 3 tiers and be overall more expensive. And then they even did another price increase on it last year. And they didn't really have to do that because they don't have to compete with Game Pass. Game Pass's biggest problem is that it's cannibalizing game sales. And I'd bet that internally at Microsoft, whether they acknowledge it or not, they all understand that a huge reason they have to become a third-party publisher is because not only they have Game Pass, but because they spent so much money on big publishers like Activision and weren't making it back with traditional game sales. And the biggest reason for that is because they told everyone, give us a few bucks a month and you can play everything for free. I mean, it's a hard deal to pass up if you have an Xbox. And then Sony makes PS Plus Essential, Extra, and Premium and totally cannibalizes the sales of Horizon Forbidden West. That's why we haven't had a lot of first-party games dropping on there as soon as that game did. It's kind of like something that no one really cares about, and it's taking development and time resources away from better better features that could be added to the PS5, like themes. So with that in mind, that's just one example of many. I hope Sony does not start putting a ton of games on Xbox. I think we'll see some stuff on Switch like Lego Horizon Adventures, but I hope they keep a very hard line on what actually makes it over to Switch, because I think it's very clear that the reason Sony works so well is because they have great first-party exclusive games, and to have that go away, I mean, I think that's a huge reason why the Steam Deck has only sold 3 million units, right? Like, it's the best handheld you can buy to play pretty much everything under the sun because, you know, you access Steam and Sony puts their games on Steam, Microsoft puts a lot of their games on Steam, Nintendo doesn't, but you can emulate the Switch, so it doesn't really matter. But they don't have a killer app, right? Like Elden Ring was the killer app when it launched because it ran so well on the handheld and it was cool and novel. But since then, there have been a few standout games for Steam Deck, but nothing directly from Valve. And I feel like if they did that, like they made a first party game like Half-Life 3, for example, or Left 4 Dead 3, and said, hey, we developed this with Steam Deck in mind to be able to take this game on the go, I think you'd see a lot more people buying Steam Decks. I think that's a huge reason why Sony has dominated so much since the end of the PS3 generation. It's because of their excellent first-party games, so keep them first-party for as long as possible. Anyway, speaking of exclusive games, see how I tied all this together? That brings us to the third news story here, which is that Sony has a good secret for us, which is a brand new AAA studio working on a monumental game for PlayStation underneath the first party. This studio is open in LA. They've got a bunch of people from Deviation running it, old Call of Duty execs running it. You know what I'm thinking, right? This could be Sony finally trying to do something with their dormant shooter IP. Stuff like SOCOM, stuff like Killzone, stuff like Resistance. I mean, they have great stuff just sitting there, languishing, ready to be used, and now they have a studio that's being led by an old Call of Duty executive. I kind of see the future where Sony is actually making maybe a military-themed shooter, maybe an extraction shooter, maybe what we've been asking for since SOCOM 4, basically. I mean, I don't know, guys. Is Sony going to make the smart move here? I'm glad to see it, though, that they're potentially moving in the right direction. The reason we know about this is because they're looking for a project senior producer, and the candidate will work on a newly established AAA studio based in Los Angeles, and they'll be working on the next groundbreaking AAA original IP, and they even go as far as to say it's a high caliber game. I mean, this is great, right? Like, you know, we've been waiting 4 to 5 years between releases, and it's clear that that's not going to get better anytime soon. Games just take longer to make, so it seems like the strategy for Sony is open their own internal studios and fill out that release schedule with more games. The big downside is this is a new studio, right? Like, it's being spun out from Deviation Games, the people who made Destruction All-Stars, and apparently were working on Twisted Metal before they were shut down. But, you know, it sets them up well for the future, where hopefully towards the tail end of the PS5 generation, we get a bunch of games thrown in right at the end, but then we won't have as long of a wait for the sequels to those games or the follow-ups to those games when the PS6 eventually comes out. Now, I know we all want these old franchises back, but there is a huge possibility that whatever they're working on is a new IP. I mean, that just makes a lot of sense because that's what Sony likes doing, creating new IP in their game space that they can then take and mine from in their movie space or their TV space. You know, they want to make big hits that draw people to the PlayStation console and the PlayStation brand, and the timing couldn't be better, right? Like Microsoft, not by them creating amazing franchises, by them buying and paying for amazing franchises, the point still stands that under their umbrella, they have a lot of great franchises now. Stuff like Doom and Call of Duty and X, Y, and Z. I mean, there's like a million games that they own now, and Sony has been kind of forced to compete with that by, you know, Xbox just throwing money around the entire gaming industry. It does help, like I said in the first story, that Xbox is basically becoming third party, but every game that Microsoft sells, like Call of Duty, yes, Sony gets a 30% cut, but obviously, you know, whatever this is will probably end up being a live service game, because even though they failed so miserably with Concord, Herman Holst is adamant that Sony creates a live service game, and I honestly get that, because if you get one live service game that hits at the level of something like Apex Legends or Fortnite or Call of Duty or X, Y, and Z, the list goes on and on of massive money-making potential games in the live service space that can fund everything for decades to come. Like, if you just just keep updating these games that people get hooked on and start spending microtransaction money or battle pass money in perpetuity forever, that just generates untold levels of revenue that you can then spend on first party games to keep your main hardcore base happy. I just want to say at the end of the video, if you're someone who's going through the fire situation in Los Angeles, my heart goes out to you. If you guys didn't know, I lived in LA for almost 9 years. Right after college, I moved there, and that's how I became a YouTuber. I started working for Austin Evans, and then I worked my way up before eventually starting my own channels, and then moved back here to Michigan where I grew up. But I really like LA. I really enjoyed living out there. It got so expensive, man. Like, even making okay money as a YouTuber, it's not tenable to live there long term, because if you're buying a house, you're going to rent one. And I can't imagine the situation I'd be in if I had bought a house and watched it burn to the ground. So if anything happened to you like that, my heart goes out to you. I literally cannot imagine. I know there's a lot of charities out there. Do your due diligence before you donate any money, because a lot of them, don't actually give the money to where they say it's going. Try to find some good charities, but if you've got a couple extra bucks, make sure you donate to someone who really needs it. I've seen a lot of tragedies like this. I've seen a lot of charities get boosted, and then you hear 6 months later that none of the money actually went to the people. So if you are going to donate, do a little bit of research before you give your money away, because you want to make sure it actually goes to the people who need it and not some politician or something. But just wanted to say sorry to everyone who's affected by that, and I hope you recover strong, fast, and that they get these fires under control, because it is crazy. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you in today's video. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.